12 rules is just too many. So he had this book, 12 Rules for Life, but it was based on a Quora thing that he did years and years ago before he got famous, where he had something like 42 or 44 or 46 rules. That is too many. He had another book, 12 More Rules for Life. He has those 42 rules, assuming that there's some rules that don't overlap between the original and these other 24. We're now pushing 50 rules or more. Now, this is somebody that is just so scared of life. If you're not scared of life, if you know how to live life, you're not going to have 12 rules, much less 24 or 42 or 50 or 60. You're just not. The real shame here is that Jordan Peterson is intentionally cultivating children, teenagers, young adults, young men without direction, and he's telling them, just like I, Jordan Peterson, am so scared of life, and I need all these boundaries and all these safety helmets and all these knee pads and all these padded walls. I'm going to assume that you need the same exact thing. You have the same fears that I have. And that's just totally useless, right? That's not going to be, that's not something that kids need to hear. More than anything, you need to feel again and again, the world is actually, despite what he says, it's a lot less scary than you think. And hopefully the older that you get, the less scary the world becomes, the less scary death becomes, the less scary freedom becomes. He's so scared of freedom. This is why he needs 50 plus rules. So I meant to do this video a long time ago, but never got around to it. Today, we are going to be discussing Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, but not just discussing them. We're actually going to improve upon them as we go through each of the rules. But before we do that, for the patrons, there's going to be a video after this one. And I'm just going to talk about a bunch of books that I recently read. We have Vladimir Vysotsky's Nerve. This is an interesting text because if you see the edition, it's 1988. Now, the first edition of this book was 1981. It was published a year after his death. It also has an introduction about maybe 10, 15 pages long that serves very much as a propaganda piece, right? They were trying to suppress news of his funeral in 1980. By 1981, it was absolutely just kind of like incumbent upon the USSR to actually release something of his work, right? To do some sort of official edition. There's actually, so this is Mark Twain's Mississippi Writings, right, from the Library of America, right, is the edition. And I'm going to be talking about a lesser known book of his called Pudd'nhead Wilson. It's not, I would say, as great as Huckleberry Finn, but it gets pretty close, especially in some sections. So very underrated, very little discussed. Most people don't know about it. Most people don't read it. And on vacation, I read Leo Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich in English and then also in Russian because I wanted to compare the translations, but we'll talk about the book in general more broadly, not just the translation. And of course, some more stuff from Bruce Ario's selected poetry. Some of you guys already know I'll be doing a documentary film. I'll be shooting with Joel Parish in Minneapolis at the end of October. And I'm just preparing, right, structurally what that text is going to look like, what the film is going to look like, right, going through the poems and just some stuff that I picked up while I was on vacation reading. So to get to 12 Rules for Life, if you think about the idea of somebody who creates a list of rules to follow, the larger that the list becomes, the more that you get the sense that this is somebody that feels there needs to be not only so many boundaries in life, but also you need the boundaries specifically because life is too scary. Now, I find that a little bit disturbing because it seems like the majority of the people that are Jordan Peterson's audience are, they tend to be kids, right? They tend to be either very young adults or they tend to be teenagers. Actually, like if you look at my biggest Jordan Peterson video, the Stylism, right, where I tackle not just Jordan Peterson, but names like Christopher Langan. If you look at the comments there, talking with them, arguing with them, it's the same kind of sense, right? I just get the idea that these are people very fearful of life, right? These are people that are looking for direction. And here Peterson comes along with 12 rules for life. Now, before we even get to his first rule, the first rule that I would give is, just judging by the length of the text, is 12 rules is simply far too many, okay? 12 rules is too many. Another disturbing facet to all this is originally he wrote this Quora thing like years and years ago, well before he got famous. And it was something like 42 or 44 rules for life. So he recently released another book, 12 more rules for life. So it's 12 plus 12 is 24. Assuming that those 24 rules have material within them that's separate from the 42 original rules on Quora, that means we're talking about a guy that in his kind of ideal scenario, of course, like you can't really sell a book if you're going to be promising like 50 rules, right? But in his kind of ideal scenario, in his mindset, he really would look for something like 50 plus rules to just understand the world, right? To be able to function in the world. And that's horrible. In general, what I notice is that, especially as you get older, obviously when you're younger, right, you have more rules placed upon you. There's very good reasons for that, right? Especially young viewers out there. You might be very kind of annoyed and resentful of the fact that your parents or your teachers or whatever have all these strictures for you. But they're actually very important because by the time that you become an adult, if you don't have these rules, you're not really used to structure, right? And you can't really find a way to structure your own life. But the older that you get, you really should be not increasing these rules, not maximizing them, but dropping them, okay? You should be having fewer and fewer and fewer things to worry about because your entire kind of either moral compass or your sense of what you need to do in the world, it needs to be more precise. And it needs to have less fluff, right? It needs to have less fat. It needs to have just like less stuff for you to worry about. You need to know exactly what you need to do and really just kind of like distill everything into as few rules as possible. So you don't even have to like bother about like memorizing them. So my first rule, right, before we even get to the other rules is 12 rules is far too many. In my ideal world, I would make a video maybe with 5 rules, but I know that people really love numbers. So I did come up with 8 rules, right? I distilled not only Peterson's 12 rules, I eliminated some, I added others that really needed to be added. But just like for your own sanity going forward, just really keep in mind, you need to simplify your life, okay? You don't need complications. You need to worry about what am I doing that is just kind of like taking me off of my actual path. Now, Jordan Peterson's actual first rule is going to be my second rule. So his first rule is stand up straight with your shoulders back. Now, there's a few issues, first of all, like with the chapter itself, before you even get to the kind of like summative rule. He does this thing all the time in his interviews and in his books where he keeps trying to sneak in sort of like normative statements under the guise of just purely a descriptive language. So while he's describing biology in hierarchy in a way where it's like, well, I'm just giving you objectively how the world works, right? This is just kind of how biology works. These are how hierarchies work. The problem is he doesn't simply leave it at that. By implication, he turns a descriptive statement into a normative one, right? These are the way that things ought to be. He keeps implying that hierarchy, specifically the kinds of hierarchy that he envisions as maybe the best way for the world to function. He keeps assuming that this hierarchy is the be-all, end-all, and it ought to be that way, and we ought not to really, if not just totally like winnow it down, at least polish it in some way, right? Which is a problem. This is how he gets to his first rule, right? He says, for instance, that if you are able to stand up straight and not slouch, right? Because there is something to the idea that if you stand up straight, if as you're walking you look people in the eyes as opposed to avoiding their gaze, it does build a kind of confidence, right? Even if it's just kind of like practicing not looking away, even if it's practicing not sort of making yourself small, there is something to that, and I would agree with that. And I would agree, just generally speaking, if you're standing, you should have good posture, right? Just kind of like, just even if it's purely for physical health, but psychologically too, right? There's something to that. But to me, like, again, just thinking back to whose audience is, right? It's young kids, it's teenagers, it's young adults. That seems really kind of like a bare minimum superficial recommendation. What I would say instead is not only stand up straight with your shoulders back, instead of just thinking of things in those terms, put it this way. Walk every single day and walk a lot, right? Walk as much as you can. And the reason why it's a much better rule is, first of all, you're getting the core benefit of posture. If you walk a lot with poor posture, you will know it pretty quickly. You will start developing all kinds of problems, right? And they're not just the problems of standing. If you walk, for instance, too slowly or too quickly, if you don't sufficiently wave your arms, right? There's this writer, right, from McGill University named Stuart McGill, actually. He shares the name of the university. And he's a spinal doctor, right? He's not a surgeon or anything, but he's done a lot of rehab on clients. And what he says is you have to walk a lot, especially with your arms swinging, and preferably quickly, because it builds great endurance in your back, right? The spinal hygienist says that walking is the best thing you could do for your back. Somebody like me, I had lifelong back problems. It's absolutely true. I used to run a lot. I mean, sometimes I still run, but generally speaking, I do so much walking, I don't need to run anymore, right? I could walk and I could lift weights, and that's sufficient. If you do 2+ hours of walking a day, 5 miles, 10 miles a day, this vacation I was just on, it was essentially a hiking trip, right? Whenever I take vacations, for the most part, I do as much hiking and walking as I can, right? Because it's very rejuvenating in a way that jogging is not, in a way that standing is not, right? The problem with saying that I'm going to stand with good posture and that's going to be the thing that overwhelmingly builds my confidence, it's very superficial, isn't it, right? You're building a confidence based on a very kind of shaky edifice, because it's like, well, why should you be confident? Simply because you know to stand straight with your shoulders back? What are you actually doing to earn it? Are you actually increasing your physical fitness? Are you actually increasing the health of your back? Because that's another thing. If you have, like, for instance, back pain, that's going to stress you too. That might put you in a depression. That's going to be something that shrinks your adrenal glands. That's going to be something that makes you overreact to other kinds of stressors. So anything that you have like that going on, you have to really get it under control, but you have to get it under control in the way where you actually earn it, right? You don't do it by popping a pill. You don't do it by getting surgery. Well, back surgery for the most part is worthless anyway. It's just a money grab. It doesn't actually do anything usually. But you really should get in the mindset, especially if you're young, of what am I going to do to actually build myself up? And if you walk a lot, right, you put yourself in a meditative state, you could fix anything that's wrong with you, right? Physically, especially, like every injury that I've had, I was able to work through. And that's like all kinds of stuff that's considered very chronic and difficult, like all kinds of, tendonitis, for instance. I had Achilles tendonitis. I had elbow tendonitis, or triceps tendonitis, rather. Right now, I have a foot tendonitis, and I'm working through that as well, right? I figured this out, and you really want to get in tune with your body. You're not going to do that simply by standing up straight with your shoulders back. Just try lots and lots of walking first, right? You could start with 20 minutes a day, half an hour a day. Eventually work it up to 1-2 hours a day. And you're going to feel like you actually earned it. So the next rule that he has is treat yourself like someone you are tasked with helping. Now, this to me is like very non-specific. In the chapter that he's discussing, he actually, he gives like stories from his like personal practice. He gives stories of like people that he knew, but he doesn't actually give you the kinds of guidelines or what is like one like big thing that you could do to really treat yourself with respect, to really increase your longevity, and not just increase your longevity, but make yourself not only have a long life, but feel good, right, as you're living it, because that's another big thing, right? You don't want to like live life and just feel terrible as you're living it. I mean, who cares if you could live to be 150 if 100 of those years are immobilized and in some sort of state of like stupor and quasi-dementia, right? You become useless to the world in that way. So he doesn't give really sufficient examples of what you really need to do, except just like very generic stuff. What I would say is also something that I did for my life is, instead of like having a rule where like just treat yourself like somebody you're tasked with helping, let's just do something practical, okay? Rule number 3, learn how to cook for yourself and do it as often as you can. If you can do it every day, do it every day. And if you have a romantic partner, teach him or teach her. If they don't know how to cook, teach them. One thing, when I was like in long-term relationships that annoyed me in retrospect is, before I got married, is most of the people that I was with, they could not cook, right? I was the only one cooking. And I learned how to cook partly because, like, at the beginning it was to save money, and then later on it was to lose weight, right? Because I was morbidly obese, and I was like, look, for me to like really keep weight off permanently, I have to totally change my habits, right? Don't view things as like, oh, I'm on a diet. No, you're not on a diet. You're just changing what you eat, right? And you're going to do this forever. You're never going to stop. But if you just eat out all the time, you're not going to have any control over what you eat, right? It's very rare, especially in American restaurants, for you to get something with tons of vegetables. Even if I do order out, like I always have like a bag of like, you know, Trader Joe's greens or whatever. You get like a bag of like organic salad, a big bag for like $2.99. It's worth it. If you don't have enough vegetables, at least you have that. But generally speaking, you should really be cooking for yourself every single day. Another thing about that is, I mean, you don't want to be an adult and be in a situation where you don't know how to cook your favorite meal in the world, right? One thing that I love about just kind of like everyday existence is if I really, you know, like if I really, really want to eat something, I know how to cook it, right? My favorite meals, my favorite dishes, whether it's like, so like my favorites are Indian dal. I'm not going to depend on somebody else to make that for me. I love making spaghetti with red sauce, with like a turkey sausage, whatever. You pick up like a nice low sodium turkey sausage from the farmer's market, and you end up making like these huge plates that, you know, in the end, you're spending, you know, so much less money, despite the fact that it's much more filling, it's much better for you, and it tastes much better. And you don't want to be an adult that's dependent in that way, right? When I look at Jordan Peterson, there's no actual evidence that he even knows how to cook, right? That's the crazy part. He's almost 60 years old, or maybe he is 60 now. And the only evidence that we have of him cooking is he's been on this like kick for the last like 5-6 years where all he eats is like steak, right? He cooks steak every single day. But that should not be, you know, all that you eat, right? I'm sorry. I remember one time like listening to one of these, like, this guy had a PhD, by the way, and he did some sort of lecture on an all-meat diet, like a carnivore diet. And he's like a man that he looked like in his like 70s or whatever. And somebody asked him like from the audience after his lecture, I was like, all right, so you're saying that we could do this carnivore diet. What are we going to do for fiber? And he literally said, this guy with a PhD, he said, don't worry about fiber. You'll get enough fiber from meat. Now, for anybody listening that's not aware, no, you cannot get any kind of fiber from meat, right? This is like, it just strikes me, this whole thing is like, it's just kind of like a propaganda campaign from people who have never actually grown up into an adult palate. You know, it's like a kid that discovers a Kraft mac and cheese in a box and decides like this is the only thing they're going to eat, right? Or they discover honeycomb cereal, right? And they're like, this is the only thing I'm going to eat. Eventually, you're going to have to grow up. I'm sorry, as an adult, one of the things you're going to have to do is you're going to have to learn how to cook for yourself. When he starts talking about male, female, masculine, feminine, I don't buy a lot of that bullshit, not because I think men should be effeminate in a negative way or that women should be masculine and aggressive in a negative way. But I do think that we are clearly heading to a stage of development where men are becoming more like women and women are becoming more like men. Now, you could do that in a way that's strategic, right? You could do it in a way where you don't women don't adopt like the worst male tendencies, right? When I think of like, you know, what should a woman be like that's becoming more and more masculine, I don't think like, oh, she should be, you know, she should have the same work ethic as like a typical male CEO. No, I think instead males should actually take an example from women and say, you know what? Why are we working so hard in this goddamn rat race for no purpose whatsoever other than what? To make money? That's just going to kill you. It's going to give you an early grave. And it's going to give you an early grave without actually anything to show for it other than perhaps money, right? Because there's no actual guarantee that you would even make money in the long run. But, you know, you want to actually pursue what is meaningful. And one of the like feminine traits, I guess, if you could call it even feminine, I mean, I don't even know, like traditionally, like if you go back far enough in time, you probably will have a division of labor very often in all kinds of societies, right? Hunter-gatherer groups where men very much are also doing the cooking just like women are, right? Just like women are doing the foraging and men are doing the hunting. Just think about that, right? As a man, if you feel like you have a little bit of feminine traits and you don't look at that askance and you don't view that negatively, what are those feminine traits that would actually serve you? And absolutely one of those is learn how to cook, choose what your favorite meal in the world is, and make sure that you make it better than any restaurant that you could go to, right? Absolutely. So that would be my third rule. Learn how to cook and do it well. So Jordan Peterson's third rule is choose good friends, Essentially, like choose friends that only want the best for you. Now, I mean, there's nothing, to argue with there, but when I think about that rule, again, my mind immediately goes to, okay, we're not going to have 12, we're going to have 8 rules. How do we make it so we subsume other rules in this rule and also just kind of like make it more useful in general? Instead of viewing things as, let me choose friends that want the best for me, I would say this: make yourself as weird and as untouchable as possible. Okay? Now, let me explain what I mean by this. I don't mean make yourself repulsive to the average person. I don't mean be needlessly aggressive. I don't mean be bad to others, or don't clean up after yourself and make it that nobody wants to live with you, nobody wants to be your romantic partner. I don't mean that. What I mean is cultivate yourself enough that you're essentially never going to be mistaken for a normie. When people speak to you, they should immediately feel that, there's something off about this guy, but it doesn't have to be negative, right? Off could simply be, wow, he does a lot of reading all the time, and he does not, he doesn't want to waste time on the phone. When you are out there looking, and this specifically applies to men, especially, right? Especially to short men, right? Maybe eventually I'm going to do a video for the short kings out there. I'm 5'8" myself, and I've always been kind of like very shocked at when you look at like short subreddits or whatever, or like 4chan forums for short guys. They're so like fixated on being 5'8" and under, like, oh my god, like no woman wants to date me. I'm too this, I'm too that, and it's like, well, the fact is, if you make yourself special enough and different enough and weird enough, you're never going to actually, try to go for the type of woman, for instance, that would view your height as a deal breaker, especially if she's like shorter than you. I mean, like what? Like the majority of these men are like 5'8", 5'7", 5'6", 5'5". The majority of women are going to be that height or shorter, right? And most of them are going to be substantially shorter. Now, if you are, for instance, like on Tinder and you're swiping, and it is true that, for instance, like women on these dating apps, if you could set like height preferences, most of them set height preferences to something like 5'10", 5'11", 6 foot and above. That's true. But especially if it's like a short woman doing that, it always struck me as like very kind of creepy, right? In the same way that, if I would be swiping on Tinder and looking for like a relationship and not just like somebody to have sex with, it wouldn't even cross my mind to view something like, oh, this woman doesn't have like C or D cup tits, so therefore I'm never going to swipe on her, right? That's just like insane to me, right? I want somebody that is physically fit and can keep up with me in terms of weightlifting, hiking, all of that. I want somebody that knows how to cook for herself, because she could also cook for me, and the responsibility doesn't just fall on me, right? I want somebody that reads and reads a lot, right? And we could talk about books, and we could have these other things in common. So given the fact that these preferences that I have, they tend to eliminate almost everybody, right, from prospective partners, because A, most people can't cook. B, most people don't do physical activity, right? America is 70% overweight or obese. C, most people don't read. Already, that's a very, very tiny pool. But people in that tiny pool, women, men, anybody, they're going to be looking for partners that are also in a very kind of similarly small pool. They're going to be looking for people more like them. And when you start looking for people more like you, eventually you're going to have somebody that could have a functional relationship based on these kinds of commonalities. That's really what you should be looking for. It may be true that if you're 5'8", you might be repulsive to some percentage of women, right? They will never view you even as a prospective sexual partner. I'm positive that women have rejected me because of my height and never told me about it. But again, isn't there something kind of like pathetic and creepy about it? Like, just turn the tables on a guy, right? Again, to use the example of swiping somebody only if you have D-cup tits, there's something really kind of like fucked with your head, especially if you're looking for a relationship and this is your standard and this is where you're looking for. So you have to like just view this in terms of like, what can I do to make myself likable, right? It could be repulsive to, some percentage of people, but also not untouchable to the people that matter, right? The people that matter are going to be the people that end up surrounding you, right? Even like my friends now, right? I mean, the vast majority of my friends these days are people that I've met online. And I've met them online because, even if I go to like some of the places with people that have my own interests, such as like, I don't know, I could go to like a museum or whatever, right? And I could like specifically avoid, bullshit modern art or whatnot. Still, for the most part, like I could maybe struck up some conversations, but these are probably not people that I could date. These are not people that I could probably be friends with. If I go to even a library or a cafe, yes, the pool of people there will be likelier people that I could date or develop friendships with. But for the most part, given that I am just kind of like, honestly, I am weird, I am odd, but I lean into that, right? I never turn away from that. That's going to be the way that I would adjust this rule, right? Don't just view this as like, like friends that want the best for me. View it as, who am I going to attract, right? It's not just a matter of like, how can I make sure that people don't mistreat me? You have to be a certain kind of person that only certain kinds of people would want to be friends with. You have to actually work on yourself for that to be the case. You can't just hope that you're going to pick and choose and it's going to work out for the best. You have to be a certain way. And honestly, when that happens and like friends fall by the wayside eventually because you're a certain way, or maybe like you grow too much and you constantly growing and everybody around you is like not growing, that just tells you that you can't be around certain people, and that's perfectly fine. Because eventually, like, the only friends that you will have if you are a certain way are the friends that really want to be your friends. So Peterson's fourth rule is going to be my fifth rule, right? We're going to actually combine a bunch of stuff later. So his fourth rule is compare yourself to the person you were yesterday, not someone else. Now, I actually think that's a very good rule to follow, because, and this is true for people that are lacking in talents and people that have a ton of talent, right? For the people that are lacking in talent, maybe little by little, even if you're not like a talented writer or a talented reader, maybe, if you started with like reading one book a year, which is, when I was like in high school, whatever, the first couple years of high school, it was rare for me to like read a book independently. One of the first books that I read independently with like actual interest, and I really, really thought about it. I remember I was in New Jersey and I was reading Richard Wright's Native Son, and it really had an effect on me. And it was a long book. But it took me like a couple of months to read it. I was reading it very, very slowly. Eventually it got to the point where I was reading a lot, right? So if you're in the category where if you're not a reader and you want to be a reader, well, little by little, like you could just improve upon yourself, not thinking like, well, somebody else, right? Some savant, right? You have like videos of savants that are able to literally read read a page like every few seconds, right? I'm never going to be able to do that. I'm a very slow reader to begin with. But even if you are somebody with a ton of talent, and this is where things get really tricky, if you are somebody that is very intelligent, is able to write well, is able to be like a great painter or whatnot, it's very easy in that scenario to just tell yourself like, you know what, if I give 50% effort or 70% effort, I'm able to accomplish a lot more than if somebody gives 100% effort. So since I'm able to like essentially do a bit more than the average person by, giving 70% effort or 60% effort or 40% effort or 25% effort, I'm just going to stick to 25% effort. That's very, very bad, because you're really shortchanging yourself, right? If you have something innate within you, like some inborn set of talents or whatnot, or let's say you're one of these people that from the very beginning you're able to read very quickly. You can't tell yourself, you know what, since I'm able to read essentially a book an hour, let's say you're that type, you're able to read like a full-size novel in an hour or 30 minutes. You can't say, I'm going to do that once a month. No. If you can read a book an hour or a book every 30 minutes, you better be reading 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books a week, right? Assuming that you have the time to do that, I would actually change Peterson's rule a little bit here. So it's not simply that you should merely compare yourself to yourself. I would say this: you are the standard, but others do polish it. You do have to have a sense of what other people are doing. You do have to have a sense of what other people's accomplishments are. This is specifically, this is especially, I guess, if you have like talents that you want to cultivate, because, what is a talent if it's just something that is like totally solipsistic, right? You can't just be purely self-referential in that regard. Like if you're going to be a writer, for instance, you constantly have to be reading what other people have written. If you're a painter, you have to be aware of what the painting world is, what it was, right? You have to be aware of the history of art. ultimately you're going to have to be your own standard in some regard. But in the long run, the world does serve as a nice basis for comparison, right? If you do it in a way that has some strategy behind it. He has this, so he sometimes talks about children in this book, and he has his rule number 5 is, don't let your children do anything that causes you to dislike them. And I guess, that's sort of true in some ways. You would actually really need to unpack this quite a bit and to offer various kinds of caveats. First of all, in terms of, you disliking your children, well, what if something that they're doing is perfectly reasonable and, you dislike them just because there's something wrong with you? He really glosses over this part of the book where, again, this is a whole idea where, he starts with this whole notion of, I'm going to have all these descriptive statements, but I'm going to sneak in all these other normative claims. One of these descriptive statements is the fact that it is true that if you have children and they're constantly doing things that you dislike, you're going to create, a toxic relationship, right? You're going to have tons of resentments. You're going to create problems in your interactions, right? You're not going to be a healthy parent, and they're not going to be healthy children, and they're not going to become most likely healthy adults. At the same time, he sort of assumes that, well, simply that's because that's the case. We have to just always do everything that we can to keep us from disliking our kids, which means keeping them from doing anything that you dislike. But again, you sometimes have to be introspective about this. But also, it's just it's so oddly specific, right? It's geared only towards those with kids, which is the other thing. It's one of those items where it seems to be descriptive, but it's also normative, isn't it? Right? He does, he doesn't say it outright in this book, but he does say it elsewhere, where the idea is you have to have children. You have to have children. If you don't have children, it's going to be a problem for you. Well, maybe not, right? It doesn't work out that way for everybody. It's not a problem for everybody. In fact, there's plenty of people that literally should not have kids, right? Especially if they have not figured out their own lives. And some, honestly, there are people out there that merely by the presence of children, they're going to be resentful, and there's going to be no way around that, right? And if you have too much resentment as a parent, that's not going to be useful to your child. So might as well not have kids in that scenario. So it's too oddly specific. So I'm actually going to combine this rule with some other rules that he has. So set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. This is rule number 6. Later on, he says, be precise in your speech. And we've already kind of seen hints of this, but especially here, right? This is just a terribly written rule. Because first of all, it doesn't make any sense. You cannot actually set your house in perfect order ever, right? That is not supposed to be something that you pursue. You could pursue perfection with the understanding that you're never going to hit it. And you might even sometimes pursue perfection with the understanding that perfection in and of itself is a kind of imperfection, right? On this channel, or if you read Cosmoetica from Dan Schneider, we often talk about the idea that a perfect poem or a perfect novel may not necessarily be the same thing as a great novel or a great poem. The perfection itself, right, by being too, squeaky clean in some regards, it doesn't have the kinds of tendrils that might go in all kinds of other directions that really make greatness work as greatness, right? Greatness that becomes more difficult to put into words. So perfection as a thing, right? You're never going to hit it to begin with. But just also this idea that, even the idea that you have to be, let's say, even close to perfect for you to criticize the world, that is very silly, right? Look, we could have somebody theoretically that is a serial, a serial cheater, right? Anytime that he gets married, he cheats, divorces his wife, cheats, divorces his wife, so on and so forth. Or you have a wife that could do that, for instance. That does not mean a serial cheater cannot actually go out and criticize a mass murderer, right? So it's just in and of itself, it's very silly, right? The same thing applies to world leaders, right? You could potentially have, somebody like Johnson, right? Johnson was an imperfect president, right, as a ruler in many respects, right? Especially when it comes to stuff like foreign policy. But the last thing in my mind when I think about Johnson as a president is, oh, he would actually, remember all those times that he would whip out his dick in the Oval Office and he would like harass colleagues or secretaries or whatnot with his dick. Like, yeah, I don't like sexual harassment in that regard, right? It's unprofessional at the very least. But at the same time, I would much rather take a president who declares a war on poverty versus somebody that never whips out his dick but does not actually have any proper legislation to his name, right? Because obviously, I mean, that kind of like interpersonal stuff that you do has like effects on the people around you. But really, in that kind of position of power, really like the kind of like wider decisions that you make, they're going to be the things that have like much wider reverberations. I mean, let's face it, right? It's also very hypocritical to have that kind of rule on Peterson's part, right? He certainly has a totally, imperfect home life. Even when it comes to like the whole like don't let your kids do anything that makes you dislike them. I mean, like, look, Michaela Peterson, is that her name? Michaela? Yeah, Michaela Peterson. She's a total like agent of chaos, isn't she? So she got married, right? So she's now in this monogamous relationship that Peterson views like so highly. She gets married, and then she goes off on some sort of like trip by herself, what was like to Europe or something, to hang out with Andrew Tate. Right? At the time, he was still sort of like, there were whispers about like, yeah, he is a sexual trafficker. Hypocritical in that regard, very hypocritical on his end to be somebody that has all this like guru-like public pronouncements about, do this with your life, do that with your life, make sure you don't do drugs. He himself gets so hopped up on drugs that he has to go to Russia to get into an induced coma so he could actually like get over his addictions, right? And possibly like, maybe they saved his life, maybe not. I mean, I don't even know the specific details of all that. But the fact is, like, this is somebody that is like just totally fucked up in his life again and again and again. You could see like even his interactions, like after he came out of the coma, he's become like, people say, like fanboys say stuff like, oh, he's become like even sharper than he used to be. No, he's like a more demented version of what he used to be. Like, I still remember, like, soon after he started making public appearances again, when it came to the COVID thing. So this is a guy with like all these like, comorbidities, right? He's not somebody that should be catching COVID, without vaccination. And he's out there like, after getting vaccinated, he was like, I did this for you guys. I did it so you would leave me alone, and now I regret it. And it's like, bitch, no, you got the vaccination for yourself because your dumbass almost got yourself killed. You have all these comorbidities. This is supposed to save your life, right? It's not a public service to anybody else. You really did this for yourself. But as he was saying that, he was so like, he was like screaming, he was angry, he was near tears. This is not like guys, look, I know that many of the men that follow him, you probably do have dysfunctional family relationships. Maybe you don't have a father in your life. I didn't have a father in my life. But when I view somebody like Peterson, this is not a father figure to me. This is not somebody that I would ever want to emulate. This is not somebody that you should want to emulate. He's either crying or he's screaming or he's having some other kind of tantrum. Right? This is not what when I think about like the male masculinity, he's so effeminate. This is not what I think of when I think of a male. I'm sorry, he's not. So rule number 10, be precise in your speech, right? So be precise in your speech is part of it. And I'm going to combine all these rules into this idea that what if all you criticize is actually you? Okay. And I've learned this the hard way over a long period of time. This is not something that I think Jordan Peterson has ever like publicly, come to terms with. And so like, let's see how it combines all of this. So, like, first of all, this idea of don't let your kids do anything that makes you dislike them, that requires a caveat, right? Reflection on whether or not they're doing things that are perfectly appropriate for children to do, but you yourself need to like deal right, with something going on with you internally, right? Because in that scenario, you're going to have to ask yourself, well, if I'm so critical of my children, am I simply seeing something in them that reflects something in me? And this is really what I'm getting so triggered by, right? So that's part of it, right? Assume the person that you're listening to has something to say, right? If you are somebody that is like very like unnecessarily dismissive, if you're somebody that does not actually listen with an open mind, if you're somebody that has like all this kind of defensive posture, again, you have to ask yourself, right? Is this something within myself. Like, am I scared of hearing somebody else, for instance, having all these insights into things that I myself wish that I had, right? So I'm gonna like shut it down and pretend as if that is not even transpiring, right? So we're gonna combine all these rules into this idea of, what if all that you criticize is you? James Baldwin, for his part, right, he often talks about this, right? He says that, if people like use, for instance, like racial slurs against black people, they're not actually using the slurs against them. They're actually slurring themselves, right? They are speaking about their own lacks, their own deficiencies. And there's definitely something to that. So I'm going to combine his rules 7 to 8 into one rule. So rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient, right? Nothing really to argue with there, except like in that chapter, again, he doesn't really explain what is meaningful, right? He doesn't really explain what is expedient, right? He doesn't really give you the kind of practical examples that you need. But so pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. And rule number 8 is tell the truth, or at least don't lie. He doesn't really explain that, nor does he explain really what he means by truth. Because like it seems to me like whenever he does talk about truth, it is also he also adds this like detail which I find very annoying, where in his public appearances as well as his book, he keeps referring to like his past self in a way where, oh, that has nothing to do with my present self, other than like these are the problems that I got over, right? He's like, I used to be untruthful. I used to beat around the bush. I used to sort of, say and do things that were expedient, but now I don't do that anymore, right? That's the implication, right? He never says I don't ever do that anymore, but by implication, this is what you're supposed to take away from that, which is, especially annoying because first of all, we know that that's not true, and B, it's just not like if he's going to be a self-help guy, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you could be a good, talented self-help guy, but that's not very useful to your audience if you're going to be the self-help guy that does not even honestly deal with yourself as you are, right? Everybody's always dealing with imperfections, right? Everybody's always trying to become better in some way. So for you to say all these big issues I used to have but not anymore, at the very least, start talking about some present day issues, right? At the very least, like if you did get addicted to those drugs, there's no shame in that. People get addicted to shit all the time. So instead of just dealing with like meaningful, not meaningful, truth, lie, and just like trying to understand what all that is, I'm just going to combine this into something that he does actually say in the book and elsewhere that I think is useful, right? Honestly, the only like intelligent thing that I've ever heard Jordan Peterson say is the idea that happiness should not be your primary goal. There's other things that you need to pursue. Not everybody can be happy. Not everybody can, go around life just like not being depressed all the time, right? Like some people have to deal with like a chemical imbalance. Drugs don't often work. Exercise might not work. Meditation might not work. You might be somebody that deals with this for the rest of your life. Happiness might not be for you, but one thing that you can cultivate, irrespective of how happy or unhappy you are, is you could cultivate wisdom. You could pursue something that is useful to society, right? What he says meaningful, right? I would just simply say, what are you doing that's useful to society? How are you going to be a stepping stone for something grander, right? Even if he loves to talk about the individual, even if you want to talk about the individual, the fact is, the only reason why the individual is valuable is the individual can potentially do something that is visionary and do something that is of serious value, okay? So I would change those two rules of his into not happiness, but wisdom, right? Don't pursue happiness, but wisdom. Notice I did not say pursue the arts, right? I would not encourage most people to ever become artists, right? I think we need fewer artists, not more of them, right? We need to be more selective about the artists that we do have. But people can be more wise than they were the day before, right? It could simply be as simple as, well, I used to be a drug addict and I realized this was actually killing me, so that is helpful, right? That is an example of wisdom. Again, happiness is not for everybody. I wish he would actually talk more about this kind of stuff as opposed to like leaning into essentially not only the audience that's capturing him, but the audience that he's kind of co-creating, right? He is creating like sort of reactionary incel types. He is cultivating those types because they're so easy to cultivate, right? There was so much backlash against like sort of like SJW stuff. Later on, that became known as like wokeism. There's going to be some other permutation, right? In the early 90s, that was called political correctness. But there's always going to be permutations. There's going to be backlashes. And where he could have been useful to the world, he chose not to be, right? So he's in violation of this rule, not happiness, but wisdom. He wanted the celebrity. He wanted the fame, right? He wanted people to pat him on the head. He wanted the money. And he got all those things, but he gave up any potential of anything positive he could have done. Even in this book or his lectures, when he talks about literature, to the extent that he still does talk about literature, it's nonsense. He talks about, for instance, of Notes from Underground. And I actually, for anybody interested, I did a video on Notes from Underground. I also discussed some of it, read some of it in Russian as well. And it's a long video. I gave you a chapter by chapter breakdown. Search on this channel, Notes from Underground, Dostoyevsky, right? I have that for you. And when he discusses Notes from Underground, I could tell that he's just looking for a backpad. He's looking for celebrity. He's looking for people to look up to him, because he's literally like taking the unnamed narrator's narration, right? His own kind of like words about the world, his own kind of like, sense of self. And he's passing off these like verbatim quotes from the book, from the narrator, as his own analysis. And it's like, really, like, do you actually want to learn something about this or what? When he talks about Crime and Punishment, not in this book, but in some of his lectures, he totally misunderstands the nature of the narrator. He totally misunderstands the ending. He totally misunderstands how, other artworks in the future were able to sort of like, redo that ending in a way that perhaps is more realistic. He's not able to do any of that, right? And he says stuff like, Dostoyevsky has totally surpassed Nietzsche, right? Which I disagree with for various reasons. But regardless, like he's not somebody that's very useful if you want to learn about literature. So he's already in violation of not happiness but wisdom. If he were truly wise, he would pack up everything he's doing. I mean, he's made enough money. Just sit back, read books, like really try to like understand what you're looking at, as opposed to what you think other people want to hear. Like you don't have to keep confusing people this way. So I don't have too much to say about his final rule. Pet a cat when you see one in the street. Other than like, I have no idea why he specifically said cat, other than there's like a little mini section where he's like showing off a little bit of his biological knowledge in terms of like cats versus dogs and whatnot, their evolutionary histories, their psychology, which by the way, he also gets wrong. I am a cat owner, right? I've read different books about cats, cat psychology, cat behavior. So even the specifics that he brings up about cats is wrong. I have no reason why, no idea why he talks about cats as opposed to dogs, other than to show off. But I don't have much to say about that rule, right? I mean, I definitely pet cats when I can, right? There's street cats all over New York City. I took in a street cat myself, right? So I'm always looking for a new colony that I might have missed, right? I'm always looking for new friendly faces that I could kiss on the forehead. So nothing wrong with that. So I won't discuss that part, but I will discuss this other rule that he has, and I'm going to turn into my own rule. So he has this rule: don't bother kids while they're skateboarding. Now, first of all, before we even get to this word bother, why skateboarding, right? There's this thing that he does again and again where he keeps treating, the male quest, right? What it means to be a man, as somehow innately more heroic than being a woman. And I guess it's more heroic in the sense that like classical literature, you have more, like male heroes as opposed to heroines. This is true. But when I view whether it's like boys or teenagers or adults, male, female, it doesn't seem to me that men or women, boys or girls, are innately more interesting than one another, right? One is not more interesting. One is not, better behaved. One is not smarter. One is not going to, pursue something that is innately more meaningful. But he views kids that are sort of like, they're trying to deal with boundaries, right? They're trying to see how far they could push themselves. And he settles on boys doing, what boys do, which is skateboard or whatever else. And he says, just, leave them alone. Don't bother them, right? This is not something to annoy kids about. So what I would say is, because girls are in a kind of identical category, they're not going to be skateboarding for the most part, although some do. It's going to look a little different. So I would actually change this rule, and I would turn it into don't bother kids. Honestly, I would say don't bother people, but I would just say don't bother kids. We don't even have to have skateboarding, right? Don't bother kids. Kids are always doing something that is like pushing the envelope, right? Pushing boundaries. When they start to push too hard, when they're going to be doing something that gets them into trouble, when they're going to harm themselves in some way that is not like, the nicks and bruises of like everyday childhood, but something that's like really bad, that's no longer bothering, right? So don't bother kids. Let's just leave it at that. So yeah, I mean, these are his 12 rules for life. We turned this into 8. I think these are much superior. I mean, tell me what you guys think. If these 8 rules are something that you would do, or maybe you would change them some other way, just let me know. Thank you guys for watching. And again, for the patrons, we're going to be discussing some real literature, right? For you guys that have been weaned on Jordan Peterson and you feel like, you know what? I'm an adult now and I want an adult take on literature. We're going to have an actual adult take on literature in the Patron show. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you soon.